The helicopter's rotors cut through the Afghan night like a metal prayer, carrying secrets that would never make it into official reports. Inside the belly of the Chinook, 12 Navy SEALs sat in perfect silence, their faces masked by night vision goggles and the kind of grim determination that comes from knowing you might not see sunrise. But none of them were looking at the mission briefing anymore. They were all staring at the small figure hunched over a Barrett M82 sniper rifle in the corner of the aircraft. Captain Evelyn Whisper Blackwood didn't acknowledge their stares. She'd grown used to them over the years, first the disbelief, then the grudging curiosity, and finally, for those who'd seen her work, something approaching reverence. Tonight felt different, though. The weight of their gazes carried an edge of desperation that made her fingers unconsciously trace the worn insignia on her sleeve, a skull with crosshairs for eyes, the unofficial badge of the 75th Ranger Regiment's most unlikely legend. 30 minutes out, the pilot's voice crackled through their headsets, barely audible over the twin rotors' thunderous rhythm. The landscape below stretched endlessly black, broken only by the occasional pinprick of light from some remote village. Somewhere in that darkness, a high-value target had vanished into a compound that satellite imagery couldn't penetrate, taking with him intelligence that could save or doom thousands of American lives. The mission had already claimed 2 reconnaissance teams. Both had gone dark within hours of insertion, their last transmissions nothing but static and the distant echo of gunfire. Standard protocol would have called for overwhelming force, airstrikes, armor, the full weight of American military might brought to bear on a single building. But the target was too valuable to risk killing, and the compound sat in the middle of a civilian population that couldn't be sacrificed for the sake of one man's secrets. That's when someone remembered Whisper Blackwood, the pilot who'd supposedly put a bullet through a terrorist's eye from 800 meters while hanging upside down from a crashed Apache. The woman who'd earned her call sign not from moving silently, but from the way her targets simply stopped breathing without ever knowing death had found them. Most of the stories were exaggerated, of course. The truth was usually more complicated, more human, more terrifying than any legend could capture. But as the Chinook descended toward the drop zone, banking hard through valleys that seemed to swallow light itself, even the SEALs found themselves hopping the stories were true. Because in 12 minutes, they would be on the ground in the kind of kill zone where heroes went to die, and their only guardian angel carried a rifle that weighed more than she did. The mission clock began its final countdown, and in the darkness below, something waited that would test every assumption they'd ever made about courage, precision, and what it really meant to pull a trigger when everything hung in the balance. Whisper Blackwood checked her scope one final time and prepared to write her name in history with gunpowder and physics, the way she always had, quietly, efficiently, and with the kind of mathematical certainty that turned warfare into art. 24 years earlier, a 8-year-old girl named Evelyn Blackwood had discovered something extraordinary about herself while hunting rabbits in the Montana wilderness with her grandfather. She could see patterns in chaos, predict movement before it happened, and place a bullet exactly where physics demanded it should go. Her grandfather, a Vietnam veteran with hands that shook from old shrapnel wounds, had watched in stunned silence as she put 3 shots through a playing card at 50 yards with his old deer rifle. "Child," he'd whispered that day, lowering his binoculars with trembling fingers, "you don't shoot like you're aiming. You shoot like you're remembering where the bullet already went." It was the closest thing to poetry the old soldier had ever spoken, and the first time anyone had tried to put words to the strange gift that seemed to flow through her like electricity. Growing up in Billings, Montana, Evelyn learned to hide her abilities behind a carefully cultivated mask of normalcy. She played softball, struggled with algebra, dated the quarterback briefly before realizing she found tactical manuals more interesting than high school romance. Her parents, both teachers at the local elementary school, worried about their daughter's obsession with precision shooting and military history. They couldn't understand why she spent hours studying ballistics tables and wind patterns, when other girls her age were focused on college applications and social media. The truth was that Evelyn had already decided her future the day she turned 18. While her classmates celebrated graduation with parties and beach trips, she walked into the Army recruitment office in downtown Billings and signed papers that would take her as far from Montana as physics and determination could carry her. The recruiter, a tired-looking sergeant with deployment ribbons covering half his chest, had tried to steer her toward communications or logistics, safer jobs that wouldn't put a pretty girl in harm's way. She'd responded by asking if they had a shooting range on base. 20 minutes later, after she put 30 rounds through the same hole at 200 yards, the recruiter was making phone calls to people whose names didn't appear on organizational charts. By the end of the week, Evelyn Blackwood had been fast-tracked into a training program that officially didn't exist, designed to produce the kind of soldiers who solved problems that conventional warfare couldn't touch. Fort Benning, Georgia, became her graduate school in applied violence. The Ranger School instructors had seen plenty of hotshot recruits who thought they could shoot. Most of them washed out within the first month, broken by the realization that real combat had nothing to do with paper targets and everything to do with split-second decisions under pressure that would haunt you forever. But Evelyn was different. She absorbed punishment like a sponge, learned from every failure, and demonstrated a kind of supernatural calm under fire that made even hardened drill sergeants pause and reconsider their assumptions about human limitations. The first time they called her Whisper was during a night training exercise in the Georgia swamps. Her squad had been pinned down by enemy forces using paintball rounds and pyrotechnics to simulate a full-scale firefight. While her teammates returned fire with the desperate intensity of soldiers trying not to die, Evelyn had gone completely still, her breathing slowing to almost nothing as she calculated angles, wind speed, and the subtle movements of their attackers. The opposition team had been using a sniper of their own, a cocky staff sergeant with 2 combat deployments who'd been picking off her squadmates from a concealed position nearly 400 meters away. For 30 minutes, he dominated the battlefield, his shots coming with mechanical regularity every time one of her people tried to move. Then Evelyn had chambered a single round, taken a breath that seemed to last forever, and sent a paintball through a gap in the foliage no wider than a coffee cup. The staff sergeant had looked down at the bright orange splatter across his chest with an expression of genuine bewilderment, as if the laws of physics had personally betrayed him. "Jesus Christ," someone had whispered over the radio. "She doesn't even make a sound when she shoots, like a goddamn whisper." The nickname stuck, and within 6 months, Evelyn Blackwood had become the kind of legend that other soldiers told stories about in mess halls and barracks around the world. But legends, she would learn, came with a price that couldn't be measured in medals or commendations. They came with the weight of impossible expectations, and the knowledge that every trigger pull carried the hopes and fears of people who would never know her real name. The Chinook's engines changed pitch as they approached the drop zone, and Whisper felt the familiar calm settle over her like armor made of mathematics and muscle memory. In the distance, she could see the compound's walls rising from the desert floor like broken teeth against the star-filled sky. Somewhere behind those walls, a man with secrets waited in the darkness, protected by enough firepower to level a city block. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd chosen to hide in a place where straight lines and clear sight lines still mattered more than politics or ideology. The SEALs began their final equipment checks with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this dance 100 times before. Weapons were cleared and re-cleared, communication systems tested, body armor adjusted with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that kept soldiers alive in places where mistakes had permanent consequences. But their eyes kept drifting back to the small figure in the corner, to the woman who would be their guardian angel in the coming fight. Team leader Chief Petty Officer Marcus Blade Rodriguez had read Whisper's classified file during the flight to Afghanistan. Most of it was so heavily redacted that it looked like a crossword puzzle made of black ink, but the parts he could read painted a picture of someone who'd spent the last 6 years redefining what was possible with a rifle and a clear line of sight. 14 confirmed kills in Iraq, including a shot that had ended a 3-day siege by removing a sniper from a minaret 800 meters away. 6 more in Syria, where she'd provided overwatch for Delta Force operations that never made it into the newspapers, and the incident in Yemen that had earned her the Distinguished Service Cross and a reputation that made other snipers cross themselves when her name came up in conversation. 2 minutes, the pilot announced, his voice tight with the kind of concentration that came from flying NOE, nap of the Earth, through terrain that could swat helicopters out of the sky without warning. The Chinook banked hard to port, following a wadi that would mask their approach from the compound's defensive positions. Through the small porthole window, Rodriguez could see the target building taking shape in the green wash of night vision. A 3-story structure built from mud, brick, and arrogance, surrounded by walls that had been designed by someone who understood the value of overlapping fields of fire. Whisper Blackwood stood and began her final ritual, a series of movements so precise they looked like a ballet choreographed by death itself. She checked her rifle's scope, confirmed her range cards were properly secured, and tested the tension on her shooting sling with fingers that moved like a pianist preparing for Carnegie Hall. The Barrett M82 that rode across her back weighed 32 pounds loaded and could put a .50 caliber round through an engine block at distances where normal rifles became decorative paperweights. In her hands, it became something approaching divine intervention. "Remember," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the helicopter's rotor wash, "when I shoot, they'll know exactly where I am. You'll have maybe 90 seconds before they adjust their fire and turn my position into smoking rubble. Make them count." The SEALs nodded grimly, understanding that their lives had just been measured out in heartbeats and bullet flight times. Whatever happened in the next hour would depend on a woman who'd learned to speak death's language with mathematical precision, and their ability to trust someone they'd never worked with before. The Chinook flared hard, its twin rotors beating the desert into submission as it settled onto a landing zone marked by nothing more than GPS coordinates and hope. "Go, go, go," Rodriguez shouted, and 12 of America's most elite warriors poured out into the Afghan night, followed by a woman carrying a rifle and the kind of reputation that made angels nervous. Within seconds, the helicopter had lifted off and disappeared into the darkness, leaving them alone in hostile territory with nothing but their training, their weapons, and faith in a sniper whose real name most of them didn't even know. The compound sat 2 kilometers to the northeast, a fortress of shadows and secrets that would soon learn why some legends were written in blood and gunpowder. Whisper Blackwood chambered around and began the long walk toward her appointment with history, while behind her, 12 SEALs prepared to discover what it really meant to have guardian angels that carried rifles instead of harps. The team moved through the desert night with the fluid precision of a machine designed for killing, their footsteps silent against sand that had been drinking blood for centuries. Whisper Blackwood took point, her night vision revealing the landscape in stark detail. Every rock that could provide cover, every depression that might hide an enemy position, every angle that mattered when death traveled at 3,000 feet per second. Behind her, the SEALs followed in a tactical formation that had been perfected through years of operations in places that didn't appear on tourist maps. Chief Rodriguez monitored their progress through a heads-up display that painted friendly forces in blue and marked known threats in amber. The compound's defensive positions had been identified through satellite imagery and signals intelligence, but everyone knew that the most dangerous enemies were the ones you couldn't see until they started shooting. "Overwatch, this is Blade Team," he whispered into his throat mic, his voice barely a breath against the desert wind. "Moving to phase line Alpha, approximately 15 minutes to target." "Copy, Blade Team," came the response from the Joint Operations Center, 8,000 miles away in a bunker beneath Virginia, where coffee-fueled analysts watched their progress on screens that turned warfare into a video game. Be advised, no change to threat assessment. Target building shows thermal signatures consistent with 12 to 15 individuals, concentrated on second and third floors. Whisper held up a closed fist, bringing the team to an immediate halt. Something had changed in the rhythm of the night, a subtle shift in the way shadows fell, or perhaps the absence of sounds that should have been there. She'd learned to trust these moments of intuition, the way her subconscious mind processed patterns that her rational thoughts hadn't yet recognized. Through her scope, she scanned the terrain ahead, looking for anything that didn't belong in this particular slice of hell. Their movement in a cluster of rocks 300 meters to their front, not the random scurrying of some desert animal, but the deliberate displacement of someone trying very hard not to be seen. She keyed her radio twice, the agreed-upon signal for enemy contact, and watched as the seals melted into combat positions with the efficiency of water finding cracks in stone. Blade Team Whisper. Possible scout position, bearing 045 degrees, range 300 meters. Permission to engage. Rodriguez studied the terrain through his own optics, trying to see what she'd spotted. After 10 seconds of searching, he caught the faintest glint of metal, probably night vision optics reflecting starlight. The scout was well-positioned and disciplined, but he'd made the mistake of choosing a hide that offered concealment without considering the angles from which he might be observed. "Take the shot," Rodriguez whispered. "Clean and quiet." Whisper settled into her shooting position with the kind of patience that could outlast mountains. The Barrett M82 was designed for long-range anti-materiel work, stopping vehicles, penetrating light armor, and removing obstacles that stood between American soldiers and their objectives. Using it for precision shooting at 300 meters was like performing surgery with a sledgehammer, but sometimes surgery required tools that could cut through more than flesh and bone. She controlled her breathing, feeling her heart rate slow to the rhythmic cadence that marked the transition between Evelyn Blackwood the person and Whisper the weapon. The crosshairs settled on a point in space where geometry and physics intersected with human intention, and for a moment that seemed to stretch across eternity, the universe held its breath. The trigger broke with the inevitability of gravity, sending 53 grains of copper and lead across the desert at a velocity that turned distance into a suggestion rather than an obstacle. The scout's position erupted in a brief fountain of sand and rock fragments, followed by silence so complete it seemed to echo. Through her scope, Whisper confirmed what ballistics had already told her. The target had been neutralized with the kind of mathematical certainty that turned warfare into applied physics. "Target down," she reported, her voice carrying no more emotion than if she'd announced the time of day. "Path is clear." The team resumed movement, but now their formation had changed subtly. The SEALs no longer moved like soldiers following a sniper. They moved like disciples following a prophet, their trust in her abilities elevated by the demonstration they just witnessed. Rodriguez found himself wondering how many other ghosts she'd created in the darkness, how many lives had ended with nothing more than the whisper of displaced air and the finality of physics perfectly applied. As they approached the final phase line before the compound, Whisper began her mental preparation for the shot that would define everything that followed. Somewhere behind those mud-brick walls, a high-value target waited with secrets that could reshape the balance of power in a region where American blood had purchased nothing but temporary victories and permanent enemies. The mission parameters were simple in concept and impossible in execution. Eliminate all threats, secure the target alive, and extract before enemy reinforcements could respond. What made it even more challenging was the intelligence indicating that the target was being held on the third floor of the building, surrounded by enough armed guards to outfit a small army. Traditional assault tactics would turn the operation into a bloodbath that would likely kill everyone in the building, including the man they'd come to save. But Whisper Blackwood had spent her entire career learning how to solve problems that couldn't be answered with overwhelming firepower. Tonight, she would discover whether precision could triumph over probability, and whether legends were made from skill or simply the accumulated weight of impossible shots that somehow found their marks. The compound's walls rose before them like a challenge written in stone and steel, and somewhere in the darkness above, windows glowed with the faint light of kerosene lamps and human presence. In 30 minutes, those windows would become the stage for a performance that would be remembered in classified briefing rooms for decades to come, assuming anyone lived long enough to tell the story. The final approach to the compound required crossing 800 meters of open ground that offered about as much concealment as a football field during halftime. Satellite imagery had identified the dead space areas where the defenders' fields of fire overlapped and created gaps that a skilled team might exploit. But moving through them would require timing measured in heartbeats and faith measured in the mathematical certainty of ballistic trajectories. Whisper established her final firing position on a low ridge that provided clear sight lines to the target building, while offering enough concealment to keep her alive for the 90 seconds she'd need to work. The Barrett M82 settled into its bipod, with the satisfied click of precision engineering meeting tactical necessity. Through her Leopold scope, she could see the compound's defensive positions with crystal clarity, guard towers positioned at each corner, sentries walking predictable patterns along the walls, and the faint glow of weapon emplacements that would turn the courtyard into a killing field the moment shooting started. Blade Team, Whisper, in position and ready to provide overwatch. I count 16 military-age males in defensive positions, plus an unknown number inside the main building. Recommend approach via the north wall. There's a blind spot approximately 20 meters wide where their overlapping fields of fire create a gap. Rodriguez acknowledged her assessment while mentally calculating the odds of successfully infiltrating a fortified position defended by experienced fighters who knew the terrain better than they did. The mathematics weren't encouraging, but mathematics had never stopped SEALs from accomplishing missions that existed in the narrow space between impossible and inevitable. Copy, Whisper. We're moving to assault position. Call your shots. The team began their final approach, moving through shadows that seemed to shift and breathe with malevolent life. Each step was measured against the patrol patterns Whisper had observed, each movement timed to coincide with the moments when sentries' attention was focused elsewhere. It was a deadly game of chess played at the speed of adrenaline, where a single mistake would result in consequences that couldn't be undone. Through her scope, Whisper tracked multiple targets simultaneously, her mind processing angles and distances with the kind of computational intensity that turned human consciousness into a targeting computer. The guard in Tower 1 would be her first shot. His position commanded a clear view of the SEAL's approach route, and eliminating him would create a window of opportunity measured in precious seconds. The sentry on the north wall would be second, followed by the machine gunner positioned near the main entrance. After that, it would become a matter of acquiring targets as they presented themselves, and trusting that her teammates could capitalize on the chaos she was about to create. Blade Team, approaching final bound, Rodriguez whispered, his voice tight with the concentration of a man who understood that the next 60 seconds would determine whether they went home as heroes or body bags. Request permission to execute. Execute, 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 came the response from the Joint Operations Center, the three words that transformed planning into action and turned possibilities into consequences that would echo through history. Whisper's first shot shattered the night with the authority of controlled thunder, sending a .50 caliber round across 800 meters of hostile terrain to find its target with the inevitability of mathematical law. The guard in Tower 1 simply ceased to exist, his position marked only by a brief spray of masonry dust and the sudden absence of return fire. Before the sound of the shot could fully register, she was already transitioning to her second target, the Barrett's bolt cycling with mechanical precision as she chambered another round. The sentry on the north wall had approximately 2 seconds to process what had happened before physics arrived to educate him about the futility of standing in the open when Whisper Blackwood held the high ground. Her second shot created another brief moment of silence, punctuated only by the metallic click of the rifle's action and the distant sound of something heavy hitting the ground. "Moving," Rodriguez called, leading his team through the gap in the defensive perimeter with the fluid grace of water finding its way downhill. The compound's remaining defenders were beginning to respond to the attack, their voices rising in confusion and alarm as they tried to locate threats that materialized from darkness and disappeared before return fire could be directed. Whisper's third shot eliminated the machine gunner near the main entrance, silencing a weapon that could have turned the courtyard into an abattoir. Her fourth and fifth shots followed in rapid succession, each one precisely calculated to remove a specific threat and create opportunities for the SEALs to advance deeper into the compound. The Barrett's heavy recoil drove against her shoulder with familiar authority, but she absorbed it the way water absorbs stones, completely and without resistance. "Whisper Blade team is inside the perimeter," Rodriguez reported, his voice carrying the kind of professional calm that came from years of operations where composure meant survival. "Moving to building entry. Continue overwatch." Through her scope, she watched the SEALs flow through the compound like deadly smoke, their movement coordinated with the kind of precision that made conventional tactics seem clumsy by comparison. But she could also see additional threats emerging from concealed positions, fighters who'd remained hidden during the initial assault, and were now moving to cut off the team's escape route. The mathematics of the situation were becoming increasingly complex, with variables that changed faster than human consciousness could process. Her sixth shot eliminated a fighter who'd been moving to flank the SEAL's position, the bullet arriving with the kind of terminal authority that ended arguments before they could begin. The seventh shot followed immediately, targeting another threat that had emerged from a spider hole near the compound's rear wall. Each pull of the trigger was accompanied by the metallic symphony of the Barrett's action cycling, brass cases ejecting into the darkness where they fell among the rocks like golden offerings to whatever gods presided over precision shooting. "Building secured," Rodriguez called, his voice edged with the satisfaction of objectives achieved under fire. "Moving to extract target. Whisper, we're going to need continued overwatch for exfiltration." But even as he spoke, Whisper could see the situation developing in ways that threatened to overwhelm even her ability to influence events through applied ballistics. Vehicle headlights were approaching from the east, enemy reinforcements that would arrive within minutes and turn their extraction into a running firefight against overwhelming odds. The mathematical certainties that governed her world were about to collide with the chaos of human conflict, and she would need to find solutions that existed beyond the reach of physics and training. Her eighth shot reached out across the darkness to find a target that represented more than just another enemy combatant. It represented the difference between success and catastrophe, between legends and obituaries, between going home and becoming another classified tragedy that would be forgotten by everyone except the families who waited for soldiers who would never return. The bullet flew true, carrying with it all the precision and power that Whisper Blackwood had spent her life learning to control, and in its wake followed the kind of silence that could only come from violence perfectly applied. Inside the compound, the SEALs had discovered that intelligence reports rarely captured the full complexity of human nature under extreme stress. The high-value target, a former Iraqi intelligence officer named Dr. Khalil Mansouri, who possessed detailed knowledge of terrorist networks throughout the Middle East, had been found in a third-floor room that looked more like a medieval dungeon than a safe house. 3 months of captivity had reduced him to approximately 90 pounds of barely conscious humanity, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that made him worth risking American lives to recover. "Jesus Christ," whispered Petty Officer Second Class David Reaper Thompson as he knelt beside the emaciated figure, chained to a wall that wept moisture and despair. This guy's been through hell. The tactical medic in Thompson began assessing the target's condition, even as the soldier in him calculated how much additional time medical treatment would add to their extraction timeline. Every minute they remained in the compound increased the probability that enemy reinforcements would arrive in sufficient numbers to trap them in a situation where superior firepower trumped tactical superiority. Rodriguez keyed his radio while maintaining security on the stairwell that represented their only route of escape. Overwatch, Blade Team. Target located and secured, but he's in bad shape. We're going to need additional time for medical stabilization before we can move him. Negative on additional time, Whisper responded, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone who could see threats developing faster than ground forces could process them. You've got vehicles approaching from multiple directions. Estimate 15 minutes before you're surrounded by enough firepower to level the building. Move now or don't move at all. The mathematical brutality of tactical decision-making under fire reduced complex moral equations to simple binary choices: save the target or save the team, but not both. Rodriguez had made similar calculations dozens of times during his career, and each one had left scars that would never fully heal. But tonight felt different, perhaps because the woman providing Overwatch had demonstrated the kind of precision that made impossible shots seem routine, or perhaps because failure would mean that Dr. Mansouri's knowledge would die with him in a building that reeked of desperation and broken promises. Thompson, get him stabilized enough to move, Rodriguez ordered. Everyone else, prep for immediate exfiltration. We're leaving in 5 minutes whether he's ready or not. The harsh reality of special operations was that sometimes salvation arrived with a deadline attached, and missing that deadline meant that salvation became just another word for failure measured in body counts and classified after-action reports. Outside, Whisper continued to track multiple threats through her scope, while mentally calculating ammunition, expenditure versus target priorities. The Barrett M82 carried 10 rounds in its magazine, and she'd already fired 8 shots with the kind of precision that left no room for doubt about outcomes. 2 rounds remained, and the approaching vehicle convoy represented at least 30 enemy combatants armed with weapons that could turn her position into a crater if she remained static much longer. Her 9th shot reached across the darkness to disable the lead vehicle in the convoy, the .50 caliber round punching through the engine block with enough kinetic energy to transform precision machinery into abstract art. The truck lurched to a halt in a cloud of steam and automotive distress, creating a roadblock that would delay the other vehicles while their occupants processed what had just happened to their transportation. But delay was measured in minutes, not hours, and Whisper knew that her position had been compromised the moment she'd begun shooting. Counter-sniper tactics were based on simple geometry: identify the source of incoming fire, mass indirect fire assets against that position, and continue until the threat was neutralized or the target area looked like the surface of the moon. She had perhaps 2 minutes before mortar rounds and rocket-propelled grenades began turning her Overwatch position into a monument to the futility of fighting fair against enemies who understood that survival trumped sportsmanship. Blade Team, Whisper. My position is compromised and I'm taking fire. Beginning displacement to secondary position. Maintain your timeline for extraction. She began the process of rapidly breaking down her firing position, while incoming small arms fire sparked off the rocks around her with increasing accuracy. The Barrett M82 folded into its carry configuration with the efficiency of machinery designed by people who understood that sometimes you had to move faster than bullets traveled. Whisper, Blade Team moving to extraction point, Rodriguez called, his voice strained with the effort of carrying an unconscious man down 3 flights of stairs while maintaining tactical formation. We're going to need covering fire for the final bound to the landing zone. Whisper reached her secondary firing position, a cluster of boulders 400 meters from her original location, and began the ritual of establishing a new sight picture, while incoming fire continued to search for her previous position. The displacement had bought her time measured in heartbeats, but geometry and ballistics were working against her now. The enemy had identified her general area and was beginning to mass fires in a pattern that would systematically eliminate every piece of cover within a kilometer of her position. Her 10th and final shot from the first magazine eliminated a fighter who'd been directing the search for her position, but even as the target fell, she knew that mathematics had finally caught up with legend. There were too many threats developing simultaneously, too many variables changing faster than human reflexes could compensate, too many angles from which death could arrive while she was focused on providing covering fire for the SEAL's extraction. The Barrett's magazine ran dry with the mechanical finality of physics meeting human limitations, and Whisper Blackwood began the process of reloading while incoming fire intensified around her position like a metallic thunderstorm. She had one more magazine, 10 more chances to influence events through applied ballistics, and then she would be reduced to fighting with weapons designed for personal defense rather than area denial. But sometimes, she reflected as she chambered the 11th round of the night, legends weren't made from perfect conditions and unlimited ammunition. Sometimes they were made from impossible situations where the only choices were between different types of failure, and the only victories worth winning were measured in the number of people who made it home to tell stories about the night when a woman with a rifle held back the darkness long enough for heroes to escape. The helicopter extraction point lay 800 meters from the compound across terrain that offered about as much concealment as a parking lot during rush hour. The SEALs would have to cross that distance while carrying an unconscious man and fighting a running battle against enemies who knew the ground better than they did. Whisper's job was to make that crossing possible by eliminating threats faster than they could develop, but the mathematics were becoming increasingly unfavorable with each passing second. She settled the Barrett's crosshairs on her next target and prepared to discover whether skill could triumph over statistics, whether legends could be sustained through nothing more than the application of physics, and the refusal to accept that some situations were genuinely impossible to overcome through superior marksmanship and tactical determination. The 11th shot cracked across the night with the authority of absolute certainty, and somewhere in the darkness, another threat ceased to exist in the space between intention and impact. But for every target she eliminated, 2 more seemed to appear, and Whisper began to understand that tonight might be the night when mathematics finally defeated mythology, when the laws of physics encountered a situation that even perfect shooting couldn't resolve. The SEALs emerged from the compound carrying their precious cargo with the desperate efficiency of men who understood that survival had been reduced to a matter of simple mathematics. Distance, divided by time multiplied by the probability that their guardian angel could continue working miracles with a rifle that was rapidly running low on miracles. Dr. Mansouri hung between 2 operators like a broken marionette, his breathing shallow but steady enough to suggest that 3 months of captivity hadn't quite managed to kill everything worth saving. "Blade team, moving to extraction point," Rodriguez called, his voice tight with the kind of professional composure that barely concealed the recognition that they were attempting something that existed in the narrow space between tactically unsound and completely suicidal. "Whisper, we're going to need everything you've got for the next 10 minutes. Through her scope, Whisper could see the team beginning their movement across the killing field that separated them from salvation, their progress measured in bounds that covered 20 meters at a time before seeking whatever cover the terrain offered. But she could also see the enemy response developing with the kind of systematic precision that suggested professional military training rather than the random violence of enthusiastic amateurs. Squads were moving to establish interlocking fields of fire that would turn the extraction route into a gauntlet where survival would be determined by luck rather than skill. Her 12th shot reached out to eliminate a heavy machine gun team that had been setting up in a position to dominate the final approach to the landing zone. The .50 caliber round arrived with enough kinetic energy to solve multiple problems simultaneously. The gunner, his assistant, and the weapon itself ceased to function in ways that would require considerable time and resources to repair. But even as that threat disappeared, she could see three more developing from different angles, each one positioned to create the kind of crossfire that turned tactical movement into an exercise in statistical probability. Taking fire from multiple positions, Rodriguez reported, his voice nearly drowned out by the sound of automatic weapons fire that seemed to be coming from every direction simultaneously. Whisper, we need immediate suppression on bearing 270 degrees, approximately 600 meters. The 13th shot found its target with the mathematical certainty that had become Whisper's signature, but she was beginning to feel the pressure of time and ammunition working against her. Each shot had to count not just tactically, but strategically, eliminating threats in an order that maximized the SEAL's chances of reaching the extraction point alive. Missing was no longer an option that existed within acceptable parameters. Every bullet had to find its mark, and every mark had to represent a meaningful reduction in the probability that good men would die in the darkness while she watched through a scope. The distinctive sound of rotor blades began to penetrate the chaos of small arms fire, growing stronger as the extraction helicopter approached the landing zone from the south. But Whisper could also hear other sounds developing, the deeper rumble of heavy vehicles, the metallic clatter of crew-served weapons being positioned, the shouted commands of enemy forces organizing a response that would arrive in sufficient strength to overwhelm even the most optimistic tactical assumptions. Her 14th shot eliminated a mortar team that had been preparing to drop high-explosive rounds on the extraction point, but she knew that time was running out faster than ammunition. The enemy had finally grasped the tactical situation and was responding with the kind of coordinated effort that suggested professional leadership and adequate communications. In another 5 minutes, the landing zone would be untenable for helicopter operations, and the SEALs would be trapped in hostile territory with no realistic prospect of extraction. Blade Team, 2 minutes to extraction, the pilot's voice crackled over the radio, carrying the kind of tension that came from flying a multi-million-dollar aircraft into a landing zone that was rapidly becoming a free-fire zone. Be advised, I'm taking ground fire from multiple positions. This is going to be a hot pickup. Rodriguez acknowledged while mentally calculating the distance remaining to the landing zone against the ammunition Whisper had left, and the number of threats that continued to develop, despite her efforts to thin them out through applied ballistics. The mathematics weren't encouraging, but mathematics had never stopped Navy SEALs from accomplishing missions that existed primarily in the realm of theoretical possibility. Whisper, we're making our final bound. Need you to keep their heads down for 90 more seconds. The 15th shot eliminated a sniper who'd been tracking the SEAL's movement from a concealed position in the compound's outer defenses. Through her scope, Whisper watched the enemy marksman's rifle tumble from his hands as physics delivered its verdict with terminal authority. But even as that threat disappeared, she could see the systematic nature of the response developing around her. The enemy had identified her firing signature and was beginning to mass indirect fire assets against her position, with the kind of professional competence that suggested someone with real military training was coordinating their efforts. Whisper, you need to displace now, Rodriguez called, his voice sharp with the recognition that their guardian angel was about to become a casualty if she remained in position much longer. We can make the final bound without overwatch. Get out of there. But Whisper could see what Rodriguez couldn't. 3 more threats developing along the extraction route that would turn the final 100 meters into a killing field where good men died, while politicians wrote speeches about acceptable losses and strategic necessities. Her 16th shot reached across the darkness to eliminate a rocket-propelled grenade team that had been preparing to turn the incoming helicopter into a fireball. But she knew that each shot was bringing enemy counterbattery fire closer to her position. The helicopter appeared over the southern ridge like a mechanical angel, its rotors beating the desert into submission as it descended toward a landing zone that was rapidly becoming untenable for aircraft operations. But the pilot held his approach steady despite ground fire that sparked off his aircraft's armored hull, understanding that 12 Americans and one very important Iraqi were counting on his ability to maintain composure under fire. Whisper's 17th shot eliminated the last major threat between the SEALs and Salvation, but even as the target fell, she felt the ground around her position begin to tremble with the impact of mortar rounds that were walking closer with each adjustment. Counterbattery fire was an art form based on mathematics and persistence. Identify the enemy firing position, calculate the proper firing solution, and continue adjusting until the target area ceased to exist as anything more than a smoking crater. "Blade team aboard," Rodriguez called, his voice carrying the kind of relief that came from successfully completing a mission that had existed primarily in the realm of theoretical possibility. "Whisper, the bird is on the ground for 30 more seconds. Move to extraction point now." But 30 seconds across 400 meters of open ground, while under direct fire, represented the kind of mathematical impossibility that even Whisper Blackwood couldn't solve through superior marksmanship. She chambered her 18th round and settled into a firing position that she knew would be her last, understanding that legends sometimes ended not with victory parades, but with the recognition that some things were worth dying for if dying meant that better people lived to tell the story. The Barrett M82 had 2 more rounds remaining in its magazine, and Whisper intended to make them count in ways that would be remembered in classified briefing rooms for decades to come. Through her scope, she could see enemy forces massing for a final assault on the landing zone, their numbers sufficient to overwhelm even the helicopter's defensive armament. But she could also see something else: a fuel truck positioned near the compound's main gate that represented an opportunity to influence events on a scale that individual marksmanship couldn't achieve. Her 18th shot punched through the truck's fuel tank with the kind of precision that turned chemistry into applied physics. The resulting explosion illuminated the desert night with the brief intensity of an artificial sun, and in its wake came the kind of secondary explosions that suggested the truck had been carrying more than diesel fuel. The blast created enough chaos and confusion to buy the helicopter the time it needed to lift off with its precious cargo, but it also drew every remaining enemy gun toward Whisper's position, with the inevitability of iron filings drawn to a magnet. The 19th shot eliminated a heavy machine gun team that had been preparing to engage the departing helicopter, but Whisper knew that mathematics and physics had finally converged on a solution that didn't include her survival. She had 1 round left, and approximately 50 enemies who'd identified her position, and were moving to eliminate the threat she represented with the kind of overwhelming firepower that reduced individual skill to statistical irrelevance. "Whisper, the LZ is clear and we're airborne," Rodriguez called, his voice tight with the recognition that their salvation had come at a price that couldn't be calculated in dollars or strategic objectives. "What's your status?" Whisper Blackwood looked through her scope one final time, searching for a target that would justify the use of her last round. In the distance, she could see a figure directing the enemy response with the kind of tactical competence that suggested professional military training, probably the local commander who'd been responsible for Dr. Mansouri's captivity and torture. The range was extreme, nearly 900 meters, and the target was partially concealed behind cover that would challenge even her abilities. But legends, she reflected as she settled the crosshairs on a point in space where geometry and intention intersected, weren't made from easy shots taken under perfect conditions. They were made from impossible shots attempted when everything hung in the balance, and failure meant that evil men continued to breathe while good men died in the darkness. The 20th and final shot of the night flew across the desert with all the precision and power that Whisper Blackwood had spent her life learning to control. It carried with it not just the kinetic energy of perfectly applied ballistics, but the weight of a reputation that had been earned one impossible shot at a time in places where heroes went to die, and legends were born from the mathematics of terminal ballistics. The bullet found its mark with the mathematical certainty that had defined her career, and somewhere in the darkness, a man who'd built his power on the suffering of others discovered that justice sometimes arrived at 3,000 feet per second, delivered by a woman who'd learned to speak death's language with the fluency of a poet and the precision of a physicist. But even as her final shot flew toward its target, Whisper could hear the sound of incoming artillery growing stronger, the distinctive whistle of high-explosive rounds that would arrive in seconds with enough destructive power to turn her position into a monument to the futility of individual courage against overwhelming odds. She had perhaps 10 seconds to make peace with whatever gods presided over precision shooting, and to hope that somewhere in the distance, a helicopter carrying 12 American heroes and one very important Iraqi was climbing toward altitude and safety. The shells impacted around her position with the kind of terminal authority that reduced tactical situations to elemental questions of physics and chemistry. But by then, Captain Evelyn Whisper Blackwood had already added her name to the select list of warriors who discovered that some things were worth dying for, and that legends were sometimes written not in victory, but in the recognition that courage was measured not by survival, but by the willingness to stand and fight when everything else had been reduced to mathematics, and the hope that better people would remember why it mattered. In the smoking ruins of her final firing position, the Barrett M82 lay twisted and silent, its magazine empty and its purpose fulfilled. But across the desert, a helicopter climbed toward stars that had witnessed the birth and death of empires, carrying passengers who would live to tell the story of the night when a woman with a rifle held back the darkness long enough for good men to escape with secrets that might change the world. The flight back to base passed in the kind of silence that follows the completion of missions that exist beyond the reach of normal language. Dr. Kahlo Mansouri remained unconscious, his breathing steady enough to suggest that 3 months of captivity hadn't managed to break everything that made him worth saving. The medical equipment attached to his deteriorated frame painted electronic portraits of a man who'd endured more than most humans could survive, but whose mind still held information that could save thousands of lives if properly applied. Chief Rodriguez sat in the helicopter's crew compartment, staring out at the Afghan landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions like a textbook on the futility of conventional warfare. His headset crackled with the routine communications of successful mission completion, grid coordinates, casualty reports, and the mundane details that transformed life-and-death struggles into entries in classified databases that few people would ever read. But he wasn't thinking about paperwork or after-action reports. He was thinking about a woman who'd made 20 impossible shots in 40 minutes, then stayed behind to ensure that better people lived to tell the story. "Any word from Whisper's position?" he asked the pilot, already knowing what the answer would be but needing to hear it spoken aloud before it became real. "Negative," came the reply, delivered in the flat tone that military professionals used when discussing casualties that couldn't be prevented or changed. "Satellite imagery shows extensive cratering in the target area. No signs of life, no emergency transponder signals. I'm sorry, Chief." The SEALs absorbed this information with the stoic professionalism that came from years of operations, where good people died in service of objectives that would never be fully explained to the families who waited for soldiers who wouldn't be coming home. But professionalism was just another word for the armor they wore to protect themselves from the psychological cost of surviving missions where others didn't. And beneath that armor, each man carried the weight of knowing that their lives had been purchased with someone else's sacrifice. Petty Officer Thompson looked up from his patient monitoring equipment, his eyes reflecting the kind of exhaustion that came from witnessing too much human suffering in too short a time frame. "This guy better be worth it," he said quietly, gesturing toward the unconscious form of Dr. Mansouri, "because she sure as hell was." The helicopter continued its flight through the pre-dawn darkness, carrying its precious cargo toward a forward operating base where intelligence specialists waited to begin the delicate process of extracting information from a man who'd spent 3 months learning that some secrets were worth dying for. But none of the passengers were thinking about intelligence value or strategic objectives. They were thinking about a sniper who'd earned her call sign by making shots that redefined what was possible when physics met determination, and who'd chosen to spend her final moments ensuring that other people's stories would have happy endings. Back at the compound, the fires were beginning to burn themselves out, leaving behind the kind of devastation that would require weeks to fully assess and months to repair. Among the wreckage, Afghan fighters moved through the ruins with the careful attention of men who understood that unexploded ordnance could still claim lives hours after the shooting stopped. They found evidence of a firefight that had lasted less than an hour, but had resulted in casualties that would be felt for years. Squad leaders dead, weapons destroyed, and a tactical defeat that would force them to reconsider their assumptions about American capabilities. But they found no trace of the sniper who'd authored their disaster. The artillery barrage that had targeted her final position had been thorough enough to erase most evidence of human presence, leaving behind only scattered equipment fragments and the kind of crater that suggested industrial-scale application of high explosives. Yet somehow, the absence of physical remains seemed to add to rather than diminish the legend that would grow from this night's work. Within hours, stories would begin circulating through the networks of fighters, smugglers, and information brokers who comprised the shadow economy of modern warfare. Tales of an American woman who could kill at impossible distances, who moved through the darkness like death itself, and who'd held an entire company of experienced fighters at bay with nothing more than a rifle and the kind of mathematical precision that transformed individual marksmanship into strategic influence. Most of the stories would be exaggerated, of course. The truth was usually more complicated, more human, and more tragic than any legend could capture. But legends served purposes that transcended factual accuracy, and in the years that followed, the story of Whisper Blackwood would become the kind of cautionary tale that made enemy commanders think twice before assuming that American forces could be overwhelmed through simple numerical superiority. The helicopter touched down at Forward Operating Base Chapman as the eastern sky began to show the first hints of dawn. Painting the Afghan mountains with colors that suggested beauty could exist even in places where human beings had spent decades perfecting the art of killing each other. Medical personnel rushed to transfer Dr. Mansouri to facilities where specialists could begin the process of undoing 3 months of systematic brutality, while intelligence officers prepared to begin extracting information that might prevent future brutalities from occurring. But even as the immediate tactical objectives were achieved, everyone involved understood that success had been measured in ways that couldn't be quantified in mission reports or casualty statistics. Somewhere in the darkness behind them, a woman who'd spent her life learning to speak death's language with mathematical precision had written her final equation in gunpowder and physics, and the solution had saved lives at the cost of a legend that would never fully be replaced. Chief Rodriguez walked across the base perimeter as the sun rose over mountains that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, carrying in his pocket a classified after-action report that would eventually be filed in archives where few people would ever read it. The official version would be sanitized, reduced to tactical movements and ammunition expenditures, and the kind of bureaucratic language that transformed heroism into statistics. But Rodriguez knew that some stories were too important to be left to official histories, and that legends lived not in classified files, but in the memories of people who'd been there when impossible things happened. 20 years from now, when young SEALs asked about the hardest missions ever conducted, someone would tell them about the night in Afghanistan when a woman named Whisper held back an entire company of fighters with 20 rounds, and the kind of precision that redefined what was possible when skill met determination. The details would change with each telling, growing more elaborate and less factual with time, but the essential truth would remain that courage came in many forms, and that sometimes the most important victories were won by people who didn't live to see the parades. Dr. Kalo Mansouri would recover from his physical injuries within months, and the intelligence he provided would lead to operations that saved hundreds of lives and prevented attacks that would have claimed thousands more. But he would never fully recover from the psychological scars of captivity, and would spend the rest of his life trying to find words adequate to describe the debt he owed to a woman whose real name he would never learn. The official records would list Captain Evelyn Blackwood as killed in action during a classified operation in Afghanistan. Her body never recovered due to enemy action and adverse tactical conditions. Her family would receive a folded flag and the kind of generic condolence letter that the military sent to relatives of soldiers who died in operations that couldn't be discussed in public. But they would also receive visits from men who couldn't explain exactly what had happened, only that their daughter had died ensuring that other people's families would remain intact. At Fort Benning, Georgia, the instructors at the Army Sniper School would begin telling a new story about precision shooting under extreme conditions. They would speak of a woman who'd made 20 shots in 40 minutes at ranges that challenged the theoretical limits of small arms effectiveness, and who demonstrated that individual skill could still influence strategic outcomes when properly applied. Young soldiers would listen to these stories with the kind of wide-eyed attention that suggested they understood they were hearing about something approaching the supernatural, and would spend years trying to develop the kind of abilities that could transform physics into art. The Barrett M82 that had served as her final instrument would eventually be recovered from the ruins of her position, its mechanism twisted beyond repair, but its serial number still readable. That rifle would be retired to a place of honor in a classified museum where weapons that had changed history were displayed for the education of future generations of warriors. A small placard would identify it as the weapon used by an unnamed sniper during a classified operation, but those who knew would understand that they were looking at the tool that had authored one of the greatest precision shooting performances in military history. But perhaps the most fitting memorial would be found in the unspoken understanding that developed among the special operations community in the years that followed. When missions were planned that required impossible shots taken under conditions that challenged human limitations, someone would inevitably mention Whisper Blackwood, and the night she'd held back the darkness with nothing more than mathematics, and the refusal to accept that some situations couldn't be resolved through superior marksmanship. And in that way, legends lived on, not in statues or parades or official histories, but in the knowledge that when everything else failed, there were still people willing to stand and fight against odds that existed primarily in the realm of theoretical impossibility. People who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the recognition that some things were worth dying for, and that the true measure of a warrior wasn't survival, but the willingness to sacrifice everything, so that better people could live to tell stories about the night when physics met determination and produced something approaching magic. The sun rose fully over the Afghan mountains, painting the landscape with light that revealed beauty even in places where human beings had perfected the art of destruction. Somewhere in that light, the spirit of Whisper Blackwood found peace in the knowledge that her final shots had flown true, and that 20 rounds of precision shooting had purchased something more valuable than individual survival. They had purchased hope, and the understanding that legends were made not from perfect conditions, but from the willingness to attempt impossible things when everything hung in the balance. In the end, that was enough. It had to be.